David O'Farrell, a hunting guide, had to think quickly on his feet and make a near-impossible shot to save the life of his hunter. It was a life-or-death situation, and David's extensive experience and steady hand were put to the test in the most terrifying of circumstances. It was September 2022, and David was guiding Richard, an archery hunter from Louisiana, through the Yukon. The incredible area of wilderness, which is the smallest and westernmost of Canada's 3 territories, offers hunters the chance to tag moose, caribou, wood bison, sheep, goats, grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, and coyotes. The pair flew into a small, remote lake. They skimmed the water before motoring to shore and setting up camp. It was a beautiful location, so picturesque but characteristic of the Yukon. Richard was eager to harvest a variety of species, including a grizzly bear. So David had his work cut out for him, but his hunting trip didn't quite pan out as he had hoped. On the first morning of their hunt, they hiked up a steep ridge that was towering above the camp. David knew the area, and he knew that the ridge would be an excellent glassing spot to locate potential animals for Richard. He wasn't wrong. After the uphill slog, they caught their breaths and scouted the surrounding scenery. On the opposite side of the mountain, there were 6 doll rams, one of which had large, heavy horns. David knew that Richard would have his eye on that one. Then, far below them in the valley, there was a small herd of caribou nibbling the herbs and shrubs peacefully. These 2 finds straight away were bound to earn David some bonus points with his paying client. But things were about to take a turn for the worse. As the 2 crouched down watching the rams on the mountainside, Richard began to get restless. David didn't want to take his eyes off the prime ram. He was the perfect target for Richard, but he wanted to wait until they stopped grazing and bedded down. They were slowly and gradually making their way towards a broken ridge. It wouldn't be long before they lay down on the ground and Richard and David would be able to stalk closer, giving Richard the opportunity to make a relatively easy shot. But after an hour of watching the small flock, Richard asked if he could scout further along the ridge they were on. David agreed, but insisted that he stayed within shouting distance. That was a hunting guide's #1 rule. It is also the rule of the Yukon territory, and for good reason. As Richard wandered off, David kept his scope focused on the ram. The first few were begging to settle on the ground, and it wouldn't be long before the entire flock would be lying down. Soon he would fetch Richard, and they would try to get as close as possible. But just as he was thinking about going to get the hunter, he heard him call his name. There was something off in the sound of Richard's voice. It immediately sent a shiver down David's spine. Something was wrong. He stood up and turned around. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and followed the ridge along in the direction Richard had left. There was something urgent in the hunter's voice. It had an element of fear in it. When he finally came across Richard, he realized why he had lost sight of him. The path dipped slightly, and David was standing in that dip, with an enormous grizzly bear on its hind legs towering above him. David froze. In the milliseconds that followed, David weighed up his options. The bear was just 3 feet from Richard. David couldn't understand how a bear that large had managed to get so close to Richard. He couldn't tell from where he was whether it was a boar or a sow. If it was a sow, were there cubs or even yearlings in tow? If there were, then where were they, as they can also be a big problem? The next question flying through his head at that moment was what to do about it. David was a good shot, but Richard was in the worst possible position. He was standing directly in front of the bear, between the beast and David. It meant that David had, at best, 6 inches to the hunter's right to make a shot. If David moved when he squeezed the trigger, then it would be game over. If he only maimed the bear, then it would also be game over. All too often, David had heard stories of injured bears who had been struck by 1, 2, 3 bullets before becoming enraged and taking it out on the nearest thing. In this case, that thing would have been Richard. Although all these thoughts raced through David's head, and he contemplated each one, they had only cost him a second or two to think about. And now he had to make one of the biggest decisions of his life, whether to try to make the shot or not. The bear was acting predatorily. Any moment now it was going to bring itself down on Richard, and he would feel the full force of one of nature's most formidable predators. He had nothing to defend himself with. He clutched only a pair of binoculars in his hands. He couldn't run, and he couldn't fight. David had to do it for him. And this whole time, Richard didn't move a muscle. He stayed perfectly still, which David couldn't quite believe as he raised the rifle scope to his eye. He stared down it and centered the red dot of his Aimpoint Micro H1 right in the middle of the bear's chest. Then he squeezed the trigger. As soon as the bang rang out all around them, the bear dropped to the ground. It was instant. Even as the shot cracked through the air, Richard still didn't move. David chambered another round just in case and ran over to him. Richard was standing just staring at the enormous, motionless bear. "You just saved my life," he said without looking up at David. After catching their breaths, David asked him exactly what had happened. They sat down and Richard explained everything. He had walked along the ridge to glass for animals in the valley below. He peered through his binoculars, but as he did so, something caught his attention in his peripheral vision. It was the bear, just 30 yards away. He hadn't seen it coming because the ridge dropped away steeply, concealing part of the trail. The bear had walked right into him. He yelled out for David, hoping the sound of his voice would scare the bear away. But it didn't. It just kept coming. That's when he knew he was in serious trouble. By the time he called for David a second time, yelling for him to bring a gun, the bear was just 3 feet away. It clacked its jaws, popping its teeth, an aggressive sign that says, "Back off." But Richard resisted the urge to run. His heart was thundering in his chest, adrenaline pumping through him. Every muscle fiber twitched as the fight-or-flight response geared up for action. Everything was telling him to get out of there, to get as far away as possible from that bear. But he knew he wouldn't get far before it caught up to him, and he just hoped that David would come to his rescue in time. But was hugely relieved when the rifle fired and the bear dropped to the ground right before his eyes. David attributed his excellent shot to the aim point he was using. Without that red dot, it wouldn't have been clear where the bullet would strike the animal, and it would have been a whole lot harder to make that shot safely with Richard in the way.